Well, I got 10:29, so we'll wait a couple of minutes or two. This is the presentation we're going to talk about, global oil prices. Who are the players? How did we get where we are today? And what does the future look like? And this is the topics that we'll end up talking about. We'll start off with a brief overview of, this is a classic example of what's referred to as the supply and demand concept. Then we'll talk about who the players are in terms of the oil suppliers, the consumers, investors, and speculators. We don't think of investors and speculators as being active in this market, but they really are. And you can see, and I'll mention in my presentation, what the impact can be. And then I thought it'd be interesting, after sort of setting the stage as to who the players are, because I'll talk in terms of, say, so many barrels consumed in a day. And so the obvious question is, well, what is a barrel of oil? So we'll talk about what that is and how much of a barrel of oil actually go to the making of gasoline. Then we'll go into a talk on how we got here today. I have a really interesting chart from the Energy Information Agency, the U.S. Energy Information Agency, which monitors the energy industry here in the United States, which I think you'll find very, very informative. And then I'll go into what are the challenges that we face going into 2023. And then I don't want to, you talk about the challenges. I don't want the presentation to end on sort of a sour note. So I'll end the presentation on how do we go forward? What can we do, to hopefully address some of these challenges and find solutions to our problems. There is a PowerPoint that's connected with the presentation. The talk will be about 30 minutes long, and then we can go into a question and answer period. As far as some of you probably already know me, some of you may not, as far as my background goes. I spent 22 years in the military. I retired from the Army in the grade of Lieutenant Colonel. My last 7 years was in the Pentagon. I worked for the Chief of the Staff of the Army as far as research and development goes of weapons systems. My last assignment was with the Star Wars program that President Reagan started in 1983 to provide not only a ground-based but a space-based air defense program for the United States. Of course, at that time, the threat was the Soviet Union and its missiles in bomber threat. Then I retired, started a business, was doing a lot of traveling internationally. I had young kids, and I just happened to be in the right place, had an extensive international background, had an extensive background in international business, then had the opportunity to teach at the American International College in Springfield. I taught international business for another 22 years. And then I retired, but I wasn't really ready to retire, so I got back into business that I started when I got out of the service, and that's what I do today. I'm a consultant on the first chart of a business called Business and Government Services that provides consultant services not only for doing business with the U.S. government because of my military background, but also doing business internationally because of my Star Wars experience. So that's my background. I have been in the news, a local news media, probably going back to the last 15, 20 years. They pretty much call me, I would say on a regular basis through the year, generally talking about different things going on. I think I was on the news just a couple of weeks ago talking about the Chinese balloon incident here in the United States. So that's my background, where I'm coming from. Okay, well, let me just wait on that for a minute. Okay, let's start off by talking about oil in terms of, it's a classic example of the economic supply and demand concept. For example, if the oil demand is not changed and you increase the oil supply, then you're going to find that the price will drop and vice versa. The reason why it'll drop is that if demand doesn't change and you increase the supply, and then the producer has got to find a way of selling that excess supply, and what do? They drop the price. If, on the other hand, the oil supply is not changed and you increase the oil demand, then price will increase and vice versa. If you increase both the oil demand and the supply at the same time, then you can see that the price of oil will depend on a whole host of factors that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. I think another example of the classic supply and demand concept you can probably relate to is the recent high prices that we're paying for eggs. And it's simply because what happened? The supply of eggs from hens, was significantly reduced because of the avian flu, the bird's flu, influenza, that impacted the production of eggs. And so consequently, what happened to the price of eggs? They went out of sight. So that's another example of the classic supply and demand. There are a number of factors, like I said, that really influences the global price of oil at any given time, because you can have changes up and down, not only for the demand for oil, but also the supply of oil. And some of these factors includes things like shift in economic levels. Right now we're all experiencing the high inflation rate, but not necessarily corresponding increases in our wage. With the end results, we have to start making decisions to buy groceries or clothing or gasoline. That would be an example of shifts in income levels. Certainly shifts in the supply level would be another example. This is where OPEC, for example, decides to either increase or cut back on production. Individual and market expectations would be another example. Financial speculations, which I'll talk about in the presentation. Environmental conditions, like rain, snow, hurricanes, and earthquakes. Geopolitical events like war and conflict. Think about the Ukraine situation, the impact that that's created for oil prices. Global disasters like COVID, where basically economies were shut down, in the early 2020 timeframe, which meant there was no demand there at all, but you had a supply that had not been reduced yet. And so you can imagine that the price of gasoline just, plummeted. And you'll see just how far they went. The availability of alternatives like sources of energy, wind, solar, and potentially fusion nuclear reactor energy. And even the US dollar affects the availability or the price that we pay for oil, and I'll talk about that in the presentation as well. It is the collective effect of these factors that makes the oil market so volatile at any given time. It can fluctuate even a matter within a day or two. That's how volatile it can really end up being, depending on what the situation is. Think about Hurricane Katrina. When that hit, I think it was in 2005, how in a matter of days, oil prices skyrocketed up to, $4 or $5 a gallon. With this understanding of how the global market works, let's spend a few minutes talking about the players in the market. This chart here shows you who the players are. You'll find there's three major players. The first player is the oil producers, and at the top of the list is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And you can see it includes countries like Algeria, Angola, the Congo, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela. This is basically a cartel, which means they're able to control the level of supply available and in turn influence price. It was formed in the 1960s timeframe with 5 chartered members. You can see the asterisk will indicate what those chartered members are. And today they have 13 members controlling roughly 81.5% of the world's known oil reserves, and currently provides roughly 44% of the global oil market. It is worth noting that OPEC is just not Middle Eastern countries. Many times when people mention OPEC, they immediately say, oh, that's the Middle Eastern countries. And yes, there are some Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia. But there's also 6 countries from Africa and 1 country from South America, and that country in South America is Venezuela. Saudi Arabia is the largest oil producer in OPEC. It produces 10.2 million barrels per day. Next on the list are countries that together with OPEC forms what's called the OPEC Plus. And these additional countries beyond OPEC includes Azerbaijan, Bahrain, Brunei, Ecuador, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Malaysia, Mexico, Oman, Qatar, the Russian Federation, Sudan, and South Sudan. This group was formed in 2016 and has worked very, very closely with OPEC to have more control over the global marketplace. For example, back in November of last year, the OPEC Plus countries met and they decided that they were going to reduce oil production by 2 million barrels per day. And again, I'll explain that later in the presentation. The Russian Federation is the largest oil producer in this group. They produce 10.5 million barrels per day. The last group is the non-OPEC countries, which operate outside the OPEC countries. These include the United States, Brazil, Canada, China, and Norway. The U.S. is the largest producer in the group, producing at 11.6 million barrels per day. In the foreseeable future, more countries will join one of these groups. For example, new crude oil discoveries are taking place in the country of Guyana and Namibia, both of which are in Africa. Oh no, I take that back. Guyana is in South America, and Namibia is in Mexico, is in the southern part of Africa. The top 5 oil-producing countries from the 3 lists above is the United States first at 11.6 million barrels per day. The Russian Federation, generally referred to as Russia, at 10.5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia is third at 10.2 million barrels per day, followed by Canada at 4.7 million barrels per day, and Iraq at 4.3 million barrels per day. Collectively, they provide approximately 41% of global oil production. In 2019, the U.S. overtook Saudi Arabia as the world's top oil-producing country, due in part to U.S. shale oil production due to improvement in drilling technology and the Trump administration initiative to become energy independent. The second player is the consumer. And generally, when you talk about the consumers in this context, a global context, you're generally talking about it in terms of a country's national level of consumption. So we'll go back to starting with 2019. In 2019, global consumption worldwide was 99.7 million barrels per day, with the U.S. consumption at 20.54 million barrels per day. And that tells you that the United States produces about 20%, consumes about 20% of oil production each year, and that continues to the present day. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, global consumption dropped to 91 million barrels per day, with U.S. consumption at 18.29 million barrels per day. This reflected an 11.5% drop in U.S. consumption from 2019. And obviously the reason for it is because we literally shut our economy down in 2020 to try to get our hands around the COVID pandemic, which was spreading rapidly throughout the United States. In 2021, global consumption was 96.5 million barrels, with the U.S. consumption at 19.69 million barrels per day. And that shows that the economies were starting to slowly recover from the pandemic. And part of the reason was due to the availability of the COVID vaccines in early 2021. In 2022, global consumption was 99.4 million barrels per day, with U.S. consumption at 20.5 million barrels per day. Again, the note that this assumption meant that we were back at the pandemic level, at least as far as the economy went. This is a good sign in terms of global economic growth. I won't say that that's true around the world, but from a global perspective, it really looked like the world was at the point where we were really recovering from the pandemic. And then finally, 2023, which we're in the process of going into, global consumption is projected to reach 101.2 million barrels per day, with U.S. consumption at 20.6 million barrels per day. Note that this consumption is rising above the pandemic level. The last player, and it's a player I don't think we always think about, and that is the investors and the speculators. This is a more subtle player who tends to focus on oil as a financial instrument and not as a commodity. And by that I mean oil as a commodity that you use to run something. Since oil is traded in the commodity futures market, it should not be surprising to see investors and even speculators in the market. This is generally not a problem until we see major economic downturns or oil prices go out of sight due to supply disruptions or geographical situations. Like, for example, an earthquake in the case of Hurricane Katrina, or another example politically would be, or geopolitically, would be the Ukraine invasion. A good example of how these speculators can really influence the price of oil. Take, for example, the U.S. economic downturn in 2007 that set the stage for speculation in the market. The U.S. Fed, that is the Federal Reserve System, tried to make corrections to the U.S. economy by lowering the interest rate. Matter of fact, that's what we're currently doing now is during the pandemic period, which weakens the U.S. dollar, and oil is denominated in dollars. As the dollar gets weaker and weaker, then that means more people in the past who couldn't afford to buy oil because it was too expensive now found that they could buy oil because the dollar was getting weaker. Especially true of developing countries like the Middle East and in Asian countries. This made oil more affordable for emerging markets. Dropping the interest rate also impacted bank saving accounts and certificates of deposit. I think we all can appreciate that now. I mean, it's only now that CDs and savings accounts are starting to move up, but slightly as compared to the last 2 years where they were pretty close to zero. This door was open for pension and index funds to use oil future contracts as a financial safe haven, at least in the short run. And many people generally invest in gold during, economic upswings, downturns, as the safe haven. Because of the situation of our crisis, in fact, we consume 20% of the world's oil, created a situation where it was just a haven for investors, especially long-term 401k type investors. Funds flooded the market and shot the oil price up to an all-time high. Anybody recall what the price of oil was in mid-2008? It was unbelievable, the highest the market had ever gone up. A barrel of oil cost $147. Unbelievable, the cost. Now, you probably have noted that I've been talking about everything in terms of a barrel of oil. And so really, what does that mean? So I thought it'd be interesting to show you a chart. Now, in this particular one, you can see where a source is. You might find another one that might have a slight variation. But this is the ballpark figure of what happens to what we get out of a barrel of oil in terms of oil products. The standard 42-gallon barrel of oil yields approximately 45 gallons of oil products. The reason for that is that some of the, like diesel in gasoline, we add additives based on the part of the country that you're in, and so that puts additional volume into a typical gallon, a barrel of 42 gallons. So it's generally referred to as 45 gallons of oil products. These products include 19.4 gallons of gasoline, which will be further refined into the different blends. You have regular, you have premium, you have high test. 10.5 gallons of diesel fuel and heating oil, 4.1 gallons of jet fuel, 1.7 gallons of heavy fuel oil, 1.5 gallon of propane, 1.3 gallons of asphalt and road oil, 1.1 gallons of petrochemical feedstock, and 5 gallons for other products like lubricants, for example. So how did we get to where we are today? And like I said, this is really a very, very powerful chart that kind of shows what the oil situation looks at the start of just before the start of the pandemic, all the way up to the present day. And as I talk you through this chart, I'll highlight the red lines and what they mean. You'll see that in the presentation. To understand where we are today, we need to go back over the past few years, starting with the COVID pandemic in 2020. The world's reaction was to basically shut down their economies. One consequence of this was a drastic drop in demand for oil starting in early 2020. It was pretty close to zero. The OPEC plus countries, the chart that I showed you earlier, however, did not immediately drop oil production. They continued to produce. Matter of fact, they were producing at roughly 30 million barrels per day. So you can see the consequence. Demand is dropping, supply is continuing to drop, and economies are closed. And so what happened to the price of oil? The price of oil plummeted. Matter of fact, it went below zero. It went down to $37 a barrel on April 20th. Unheard, in the oil industry, never goes below zero. And this is the first time as far as recording data that they found it literally, technically speaking, went below $0 because there was no demand. You couldn't give the oil away because even if you did, nobody could use it. And you can see that right here. You can see how it just crashed. OPEC convened an emergency meeting in April 2020 and agreed to a major production cut through June 2020, which was later extended to July 2020. By early September 2020, global demand was starting to recover. It was starting to grow a little, but it ran into the limited supply of oil simply because OPEC had cut back so drastically 3 or 4 months earlier. And you can see how oil pricing is starting to go up. Production is down, but yet demand is going up. And so, again, classic example of supply and demand. What happens to the price? It started to go up. After July 2020, OPEC cautiously increased its production, and so did the United States and Canada. Recovery looked promising as the summer month unfolded. Note as demand increased with limited production increases resulted in oil prices climbing. Again, you can see how they're going up as we go through the year. Unfortunately, the fall season saw an increase in COVID cases and travel restrictions. Demand, however, continued to increase during this period because of the holiday period. Oil prices continued to rise as demand outpaced available oil supplies and reached the low price of $50 by the end of December 2020, which is about right here. By year end, however, the introduction of the COVID vaccine opened the door for more promise in 2021. We entered to 2021 right here with growing demand, rising oil prices, low oil inventories, because since production was low, countries were using their reserves, their oil inventory, to keep their economies going. So you have, entering 2021, growing demand, rising oil prices, low oil inventories that are being constantly drawn down, and cautious production increases by the OPEC country. They did not want to get into this situation where they flooded the market beyond, beyond what the demand could handle, and that would result in a drop of price, which certainly they didn't want. As 2021 unfolded, cold, wintry weather in February, the buildup of Russian forces on the Ukrainian border starting in March, the European natural gas crunch starting in early summer, Hurricane Ida in August, the emergence of the Omicron variant, and oil production continuing to lag demand closed the year with oil inventory at a very low, oil inventory at a very low level, and oil prices approaching $80 a barrel. And you can see, again, you have increasing demand, but at the same time, you don't have oil production increasing. And then you had a couple of natural disasters like the hurricane, and then also the buildup for the Ukraine war. And by the way, this $90 price was the lowest it had been since the year 2014. Note the Biden administration released 50 million barrels of oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, generally referred to as the SPR, in November 2021 to help bring down oil prices. The administration made the argument that they did it to make oil more affordable. The Republican made the argument that they were doing it because of the upcoming elections, and they wanted, to shore up voting. So, was the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve being used as a political weapon? There's a lot of dialogue going back and forth on that, because that's not the intended purpose of the reserve. It's to use it in times of emergency, like Hurricane Katrina back in 2005. Now, going into 2022 was a turbulent year for fossil fuels, starting with the Ukraine invasion in February 2022. Initially, U.S. and European economic sanctions were not placed on oil and natural gas, which was really surprising at the time, because you would have thought that that was one of the first things that they would have hit. And the reason why they didn't do that is because Europe was heavily reliant on Russia for fossil fuel, not only natural gas, but oil as well. Matter of fact, even the United States in 2022 was importing something like 700,000 barrels per day. And the question came up, if we're, putting economic sanctions to get Russia out of Ukraine, then why are we accepting gasoline or oil from Russia? So by the summer of 2022, the US and UK had imposed sanctions. And by late summer, mainland Europe had decided to impose sanctions by the end of 2022. However, the fossil fuel sanctions did not have its intended effect because countries like China and India were purchasing the sanctioned oil and natural gas at a discounted price. By late spring, the oil price was over $110 a barrel, and you can see way up in here, far surpassing the mark back here of 90, which was the highest since 2019, and at that point, that reached that point, it started to take a dip. And the reason why it took a dip was because of a couple of things. First, the Biden administration tapped again into the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve for an additional 160 million barrels starting in March 2022. Two, there was a slowdown in global demand, especially in China. If you remember during this time, China still was addressing the COVID problem. It had flared up again, and they had imposed a COVID zero policy, which pretty much shut down its economy, and so you lost a lot of demand there. And certainly the rising inflation rate, which forced consumers' choices. I mean, do you buy basic need items, or do you buy gas? In some cases, people had to make the choice of not buying gas, so you had a forced demand as far as the consumer went. And so you find that even though he had reached a peak around the summertime of close to a little over, probably about 112, 113, it started to drastically go down because of these factors starting to come into play. And OPEC was confronted with the problem, well, geez, we have to do something because we can't allow the price to continue to drop, because that impacts on their return on investment. And that brings us into 2023. 2023 started with crude oil averaging roughly $82 per barrel, slightly lower than in December, which was about the mid-80s. And this was based on relaxing COVID restrictions, especially in China, and the perception of a less severe global recession. Surprisingly, Russian oil production was higher than expected in January 2023, again, because even though the sanctions were in place, matter of fact, in the December timeframe of 2022, Europe put an oil cap on Russian oil as another sanction to kind of force them to end the invasion. It just wasn't working because Russia had other outlets like China and India buying up its oil. The U.S. Energy Information Agency, the EIA, which is the federal agency that kind of monitors all the energies in the United States, to include fossil fuel, was expecting oil prices to average about $85 for the first half of 2023. In the second half of 2023, the U.S. EIA is expecting oil production to outpace demand, leading to inventory buildup in falling oil prices, probably in the low 80s. And so you can see as the demand starts to drop because of the concern over a possible recession, the higher interest rates, the increasing inflation rate, that oil prices are starting to drop at the current level of production authorized by OPEC. The 2024 forecast is in the high 70 range. You will note later in the presentation that I will give you some data from J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, two major U.S. financial institutions who have a much higher forecast for oil going into 2023 and 2024. So that's the situation as to how we got to where we are today. Yes, we are experiencing, at least currently, a drop in oil prices. Part of it is due, in fact, to the administration's decision to release 160 million barrels that they've been doing over basically started in the second quarter going through the end of 2023. So it was a good sign from the consumer's perspective, from economy's perspective, but not necessarily a good sign, from the OPEC perspective. And so this brings us to what I call the challenges that we're facing going into the 2023 timeframe. First, you have increasing oil production. We've got to increase oil production, and that's at the top of the list. There are many factors that come into play at any given time that makes achieving this challenge very difficult. I talked about some of those factors, in the beginning of the presentation. OPEC plus countries want oil prices at a level that will give a fair return on their investment. That range, in their eyes, is somewhere between $80 to $100 a barrel, depending on which OPEC country you talk to. For example, if you talk to Iran, who's facing economic sanctions from the United States because of their nuclear power program, they're going to want to get as much per barrel as they possibly can because the U.S. has imposed oil sanctions on Iran. And no OPEC, and this is important really, no, OPEC doesn't want oil prices to get too high. They're concerned about price just as we as consumers are concerned about price. And their reason for it is that they realize that if price gets too high, what are countries and consumers going to do? They're going to look for alternate sources of energy. And that opens the door for wind, solar, and nuclear power and so forth. So they're looking for that medium where they can make what they feel is a fair return on their investment. Now, the consumer, that is you and I, in businesses, we want a price as low as possible. So what is the right price to keep the oil producers and the consumer happy? That price certainly has to cover the cost and risks involved in drilling and refining oil. And again, that's another important point to make. The oil companies really take a beating when the oil, the gas prices are really high, and they say, oh my God, look at all the money they're making at our expense. But what we fail to realize is that when oil prices take a dip, these oil companies still have to produce gasoline. So they take a significant cut, in the profits that they're making. And in some years, they're probably, operating in the margin. So it's a problem that you got to keep into perspective. Is that the oil companies may not necessarily be gouging us outright, as you may hear in the news. They're in for the long haul. So certainly, when the prices are high, they love it, and they use that to help them get through the leaner periods when the prices aren't so high. I can give one point of reference, which occurred during the U.S. shale oil boom, which started in 2011 and lasted into 2014. The U.S. shale companies were willing to drill when a barrel of oil approached $60 a barrel, and started to cut back on production when a barrel of oil approached $30 a barrel. So, is that margin of where, you're starting to cover your costs, considering the rest somewhere between 60 and 80, and how much above that really should be profit, especially when you take into consideration inflation. So is $80 to $100 a barrel a fair market price from the producer's perspective? I'll let you decide for yourself, but that's the argument that they use. Note the OPEC countries cut production by 2 million barrels per day in 2022 in response to the falling prices of a barrel of oil due to the recessionary concerns, high inflation, and the the low interest rate. Let me just back, and you can see how the prices started to go down. And in anticipation of this, OPEC decided to cut production starting in November 2022 by 2 million barrels per day. And they were doing that because they did not want the prices to continue to fall as was being predicted. They wanted it more up around $80 to $90 a barrel. The second challenge, ending the Russian-Ukraine invasion crisis. The invasion started on February 24th, 2022. The invasion has made the oil crisis worse because Europe gets roughly 60% of its fossil fuels from the Russian Federation. Matter of fact, Germany gets roughly 60% of its natural gas from the Russian Federation. That's why in the first year of the war, when the U.S. and Europe were imposing sanctions, it wasn't on the oil sector in Russia. European economic sanctions after the invasion had impacted the availability of Russian natural gas to Europe, as well as oil, because the Russian Federation provides about 10% of the global oil supply. Pretty significant. Another challenge that we're facing is lowering gas prices. Lowering gas prices is a major concern to all of us. As I mentioned earlier, 19.4 gallons of a barrel of oil goes to gasoline. As the price of a barrel goes up, so does the price. There's generally a lag, unless it's a real national emergency like an earthquake or a hurricane. There's generally a lag when you see the oil prices going up. You're going to see that in your gasoline prices probably within a 2 to 3 week period. Unfortunately, when the oil production drops, you don't see that quick turnaround. It seems like the gasoline prices stay up for an extended period of time. And this is why oil companies are accused of gouging, or gas stations are accused of gouging. Unfortunately, gas goes up. Well, gasoline prices go up faster than they come down. According to AAA, gasoline is at $3.41 as of today. A year ago, the price was $4.65. For those who have diesel for heating or for a car, today or yesterday, it was $4.37. A year ago, it was $4.61. This lower price is due in part to slower consumer demands triggered by the higher inflation rate and the drawdown from the U.S. strategic reserves, which had reached its lowest level since its inception down back in the 1970s. I think it was about 1971, 74 timeframe. Before we started depleting it, reserves are supposed to be up at 714 million barrels. And as of the present time, it's down to 371 million barrels. And certainly natural disasters and geopolitical conflicts, is a challenge itself, some of which we have little to no control over. They can happen throughout the year and can have far-reaching consequences. The Ukraine invasion will continue into 2023 as both sides start to launch counteroffensive operations. Starting this past month, matter of fact. North Korea's aggressive nuclear weapons program, Iran's continued movement towards a nuclear weapon enrichment program, and the growing threat of a Taiwan invasion by China can impact the global oil market just like the Ukraine invasion did. The hurricane season also starts up in May 2023 and lasts generally through the earlier part of November 2023. And in any given year, you can have a whole host of tropical storms that can turn into hurricane stage 3 or stage 4, which obviously can have an impact impact on where it hits, especially if it hits in the Gulf of Mexico, which is going to really hit oil production here in the United States. Another challenge is the rising natural gas prices. Europe and Asia have experienced a natural gas crunch starting with the heating season last year. Currently, the U.S. has been using liquefied natural gas exports to help Europe through this crisis. If the European natural gas situation is not closed, in other words, they can't develop their own alternate sources of energy, Europe will have to turn to other sources like oil. And in some cases, like Germany, they're even turning to the use of coal because they had closed most of their coal plants, not only in Germany, but other European countries as they approached their, I think it's fossil fuel or energy 2050 plan. And obviously, this will all intensify the oil profits or the oil problem. If we're shifting from natural gas and replacing it with oil, and we're already in a crunch, here's yet another factor that's going to drop up oil prices. The natural gas problem is serious because it's spilled over to Asia. In order to meet the crisis, Europe and Asia has shifted to, like I said, oil and coal. One possible relief, however, is that the winter months is coming to a close. And as that happens, then there'll be a natural shift away from natural gas, especially in the form of heat, which will help to drop oil prices and hopefully take some of the strain off oil as an alternative use. So what's the bottom line as far as the challenges go? Lagging oil production can stall global economic recovery. If oil prices reach $100 or higher, expect higher heating costs, higher gasoline and aviation fuel costs as far as travel goes, not only pleasure, but also business. And consumers are forced to make decisions on the buying of essential goods. And we have certainly seen that in the last year or two with inflation increasing. Decisions become even more stressful when you add in the rising inflation rate, which in February 2023 was reported at 6.4%. And a normal rate of inflation is generally around 3%. And the Federal Reserve, the U.S. Federal Reserve target inflation rate is 2%. So our inflation is high, and it has, they thought it was going down last month, but after recalculations, they found it actually went up 0.01%, up to 6.4%. Of course, higher prices will depress demand, which will have an impact on our standard of living. As the price of oil goes up and inflation goes up, we have to make choices that impacts, on what we can and can't do. In January 2023, and I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, J.P. Morgan predicted oil averaging $90 a barrel in 2023 and $98 in 2024. In January 2023, Goldman Sachs saw $92 a barrel as a possibility in 2023. Note these predictions are much higher than the ones that I talked about earlier that are coming from the U.S. government, that is the U.S. Agency for Energy and Information Agency. This is my last chart. And I didn't want to, after the challenge chart, leave the presentation on sort of a sour note. So I want to spend just a few more minutes talking about, how do we move forward? I mean, how do we get out of this box that we've created for ourselves? First of all, OPEC needs to reassess its demand forecast, what they do on a periodic basis, a monthly and quarterly basis, especially with their quarterly meetings, which it uses to determine monthly production levels to meet not only growing demand, but also to replenish the oil reserves of countries around the world that have been depleting it, to keep their economies going. Here in the United States, we've taken close to 210 million barrels out of our U.S. strategic petroleum reserves. Spare production capacity is a major concern based on the difficulties some OPEC countries have. When you're in a cartel like OPEC, they establish what production rates you have to meet. And when they increase it, not all countries are in the position, especially the smaller countries, to be able to do that. So that really creates a hardship for them. So when OPEC says, well, we'll produce 1 million more barrels, in the end they may not be able to do that, simply because collectively the OPEC countries can't produce at that level. OPEC needs to make major OPEC needs to make major investments in their infrastructure in new oil discoveries. Second thing is increasing U.S. oil production. In getting U.S. oil companies to produce more, the Biden administration needs to relax its anti-fossil fuel policy, starting with revisiting the Keystone Pipeline decision, opening up federal lands and waters to U.S. exploration, and not overtaxing the industry. The more and more the industry is taxed, the less and less they're going to be able to spend as far as expanding refineries, maintenance, and discovering new sources of oil. The current administration is very adamant about the fact that they really want to move away from fossil fuel energy. Additional releases from the U.S. Strategic Reserve can provide some temporary relief. However, the emergency reserves needs to be replenished as soon as possible. The Biden administration plans to replenish the U.S. SPR when oil prices go down to around $70 a barrel. Based on the U.S. EIA, that's not going to be until probably 2025. If you look at what J.P. Morgan and Goldman saying, oil prices aren't going down, they're going up. So we may not, in the foreseeable future, replenish all the reserves that we have been using to date. We need to resume negotiations between Russia and Ukraine to end the Ukraine invasion. International pressure must be brought to bear on the Russian Federation to end the Ukraine invasion, which has put significant upward pressure on oil and natural gases. And then another thing that we can do is increasing electric vehicle sales worldwide. Now that is not a pancreas, because a cure-all, because it's not going to happen in the foreseeable future. According to Bloomberg Energy Finance, they predict that EV electrical vehicles will have about 8% of the global market by the year 2030 and 31% by the year 2040. It will take decades for the EV sector to significantly impact the internal combustion engine used in cars. So it certainly is a solution that we're working on, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. And the last one is really a word of caution. A word of caution about the U.S. shifting away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. This is easier said than done. Case in point is the recent European natural gas crunch. It can be argued that the European crisis was due in part to insufficient long-term planning for transitioning from fossil fuels to solar and wind energy under the Europe Net Zero 2050 plan. Doing too much, too fast, without the required infrastructure plan in place, and a backup plan when alternative energy is not available, and that backup plan is the continued use of fossil fuel like oil and natural gas in less developed countries, coal. So consequently, we really do have to move cautiously, because if we don't, then we're going to find ourselves in the exact same predicament that Europe has been over the last 2 seasons, because they just truncated their fossil fuel program and they did not have in place the infrastructure or the resources to be able to cover it. So they had to go to the international community, and we've been leading the charge, for example, as far as providing liquefied natural gas. Our natural gas, in order to be able to transport it internationally, you have to liquefy it. In fact, that's one of the Achilles heels of alternative sources of energy like wind and in solar. It's a very, very difficult product to export, unlike fossil fuel. That ends my presentation. I know there's a lot of information, but I think it's a complex issue, and hopefully I've tried to put it into perspective for you. I'll take whatever questions you have, and I'll see if I can answer them. Yes?
I noticed you had the Brent, which I'm not familiar with the oil market at all, but the Brent, they were the ones, that was what they used to measure the oil right in the beginning. The Brent index maybe, or the spot price.
Okay, yeah.
Where did that come from, and how does that relate to?
Okay, generally when you talk about oil, you talk about it in terms of Brent crude oil, which is oil that is sold on the international market. Here in the United States, we have our own crude oil, which we generally refer to as WTI. I think it's Western Texas Instrument or Institute. And this is our cost of producing oil here in the United States. And it's generally about an average of maybe $10 cheaper than what it is available on the international market through the Brent spot market. So Brent crude refers to the international price for oil. WTI crude oil is what the cost to produce here in the United States.
Thank you.
Yes?
We don't have an unending supply of oil in the ground. Do we have any expectation of when it's going to diminish?
Well, it's a $64,000 question. Everybody, there's some theories out there. The peak theory that says it was supposed to end 25 years ago. And the problem that you run into, the reason why it's not depleted, is because there's new discoveries. We talked about discoveries in Guyana and also Namibia. About 5-6 years ago, there was a major discovery off Brazil. That's why Brazil is a major producer today. And the reason for that is they found with technology that they're now able to do deep water or deep seawater drilling. In the past, they didn't have the equipment to be able to go down 5,000 feet, to the floor level to be able to drill. They're now able to do that. So there's been a real surge there. And also advances in technology as far as vertical and horizontal drilling has really made available the producing of shale oil here in the United States, which, like I said, in the 2001 timeframe, when oil prices started to go up, it really made it very attractive for the shale companies to get into business. And what happened overnight, that industry just blossomed, all types of jobs and what have you. But we flooded the market with oil, cheap oil, and what did it do to the price of oil? It dropped the price. OPEC stepped in and said, hey guys, we can't allow you to do that because you're taking money out of our pocket. And so there was kind of a war between the US shale companies and the OPEC countries. OPEC eventually won, and all of a sudden, US shale was out of business because OPEC flooded the market as well, and prices went all the way down to, I think, below $30. I think it went as low as $28. And the oil shale companies can't operate at that level because of the higher drilling costs, of drilling horizontally and vertically to get to the available shale oil.
Is that fracking?
So, yes, fracking. So the answer is we keep on hearing that, eventually we're going to run out of oil supply and going to be forced into alternative sources of energy. And that just isn't happening because of new discoveries and the advancements that are being made as far as drilling techniques go. But it's like anything else. As the prices continue to fluctuate over time, people do get to the point, because of climate change and quality of life and emission and carbon emissions, of recognizing the fact that we have to do something about it. They certainly recognized it in Europe, but they reacted too fast. We're following in their footsteps. Hopefully we'll learn from them and be a little bit more cautious that overnight we're just not going to wean ourselves from fossil fuel. I mean, everybody says, geez, look at vehicles. The alternative is to go to electric vehicles. Well, you know, what source of energy do you think is going to be used to charge those vehicles? It's going to be, you know, natural gas and oil until such time that you can get wind and solar in place. Good question. Anybody else? Don't be afraid. You know, the only, you know, I used to, like I said, I used to teach, and I used to tell my students, the only stupid question is the question that's not asked. So you got a question, and you don't want to ask it because you don't want it to sound stupid. And you find that it really is a very good question, and everybody looks at it and says, gee, what a good question. I wish I thought about that. So please, you know, don't be afraid to ask a question. You don't always have the answers, but then if I don't, I'll tell you. I won't BS. Questions are good. Okay, I won't keep you. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to come, and hopefully, you know, I gave you a better understanding of why oil prices are the way that they are. There's just so many factors that come into play. Just when you think everything's going to be great, all of a sudden there's a hurricane or there's a war someplace, and you see the price just drop out. But it will come up. That's one thing about, because it's a supply and demand concept. Yes, oil will fluctuate over time. Will come up and it'll go down. And you look for that happy median.
Is that why Goldman and JP Morgan are predicting higher prices?
They're predicting higher because they don't think that the global economies are going to recover as fast as everybody expect. Because they don't think that inflation is going to come down. Matter of fact, the Feds, you know, just announced that they're talking about increasing the rate again, even though they thought that they weren't going to have to do that. And as they increase the interest rate, you know, that, you know, makes oil more available because it weakens the dollar, and so it creates new demand that didn't exist before, which drives the price up. Yes?
What's your thoughts on balancing, you know, using fossil fuels as opposed to we're killing the earth?
Oh, there's no question about that. And
I mean, it's got to end at some point.
And it will. I think globally the world has recognized the fact that we have to move away from fossil fuels. But you have to have a doable plan in doing that. You just can't make this decision that, well, in the case of Europe, by 2050, we're not going to rely on fossil fuels at all. And they didn't have the infrastructure in place. And so they found that when they ran into the natural gas problem with Russia, they had no backup. And so they had to go to the rest of the world for help. They came to the United States. We helped them with liquid natural gas. And even Germany now, that's closed down all its coal plants, are in the process of opening them back up because they need alternative sources of energy because, you know, wind and solar just isn't there yet. And we got to learn from that experience. Yes, we need to have a plan in place that eventually converts us over to alternative sources of energy. But even when we do that, you still need a backup plan because there are times and conditions when, you know, bad weather where you're not going to have solar, and you know, wind towers, you know, they can freeze and go non-operational, as it happened, I think, last year, year before in Texas. They had a major energy crisis because it got a lot colder than they expected, and it seized up all the wind towers that they had. And so they had to look for alternate sources of energy. I think the U.S. is moving in the right direction, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think the Biden administration is trying to say, well, we're going to make it happen. We're going to force it. And if we do, we're going to go through the exact same thing that Europe went through. And we won't have the options as to how do we fill that gap that the other countries will have because the world relies so much on us for our fossil fuel. But I think we're moving in that direction. But it's not going to happen as fast as some people would like. You got to have a plan, but you got to have a backup plan as well. Because if you don't, you're going to run into problems. but it's just a matter of time. Just like electric vehicles, you know, they keep on pushing that and pushing that, you know, until the cost comes down. The average person is not going to be able to afford an electric vehicle. And they're still having major problems as far as the battery goes. Not only is its storage life, but it's also very flammable. I mean, the batteries, you know, can blow up, and they're expensive. I've read an article where a guy bought an EV. He thought it was the answer to all his problems. His battery went dead on him. He had to get a new one. He had it less than a year or so, and went to get a replacement, $30,000. He was so ticked off, he basically, he set his car on fire. He said, you know, I've been lied to. This isn't the answer to my problems. You know, it's gonna put me in a poorhouse. So you have to, you know, you have to move cautiously.
What about all the solar on the roofs that they come around 3 times a week to have you convert to solar?
Oh, sure. I mean, it certainly is a viable alternative, and we're moving in that direction. Same thing with wind. But you got to ask yourself, you know, we're really concerned about use of nuclear power because of the nuclear waste. Well, you know, with all these solar panels that are being put up, you think they're going to live forever? No. They're not. They're going to have to be replaced. Do you know where most of the solar panels come from? China. From China. You know, same thing with the wind towers. You know, when they're no longer functional, one of the biggest problems that they have now is where are we going to put these monsters? How do we dispose them? You know, so, you know.
They haven't figured out what to do with it.
No.
Exactly. So, you know, hopefully the United States has learned from the European experience, and will continue to move towards, you know, some realistic, you know, zero fossil emission program. But if we rush into it, we're going to be sorry. We've got to have a contingency plan in place. I personally think to get away from fossil fuels, we should rely more on nuclear power. Nuclear power has come a long way as far as safety goes. Yes, you got that waste, but there's also a lot of research going on right now of being able to reprocess that waste into reusable fuel cells for nuclear reactors. Okay, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.